I'm Marn Frank. I'll start again. Welcome, everyone. I'm Marn Frank. I'm working as an Atlas consultant this year after my retirement in July. And I also have an encore gig. I'm working as a reading skills tutor. So I've had the privilege of being able to put into practice what I've been telling people about alphabetics all these years. My co-presenter is Teresa Fisher. So Teresa will introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to join Marn again. We've worked together many times in the past as STAR trainers, and I even participated as a STAR teacher eons ago now. I'm with West Adult Basic Education out in more of a rural area, so a lot of one-room schoolhouse kinds of situations. And I also do have couple leveled reading groups. So I'm happy to join Marn today. Thanks for inviting me.
I want to remind you that this is a 6-part series. So after today, what we will move into is vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension skills. For each webinar, I have a co-presenter like Christine, who has experience in teaching or training that reading component. So Christine Kelly will join me again at webinar 4, Rob Podlasek for webinar 5, and Penny Brown for webinar 6. Your CEUs and an evaluation will be sent next week, and you will earn 1.5 CEUs for however many of these webinars you attend. The whole series is certainly not required, so you can pick and choose from 4, 5, and 6 in the future. An important feature of this series is the participant folder, and Gail will put the link into the chat box. This folder has a growing collection of documents that are related to the content of each webinar. So this week I uploaded instructional orders, which I'll share with you more later. A document called Alphabetics Instruction for STAR EBRI Teachers and Volunteers. It's a 2-page document that Rob and I put together that really pares down how to teach alphabetics into steps and routines, but not as much content. And then a very valuable document generated last year by STAR EBRI teachers of their favorite online and print resources. And I hope to pull that up later to show you that you don't have to look around for any alphabetics resources. There are so many good ones already out there for you to either purchase or access for free. Overall, Teresa and I hope to increase your comfort with teaching alphabetics, or if you already do, expand your practices and resources. To do that, we'll begin by talking about some evidence for teaching alphabetics. Why should you, if you have students with alphabetics needs, address those skills? Then we'll talk about alphabetics routines across the reading foundational and NRS levels. So we'll always begin with a slide about what's the ideal approach for teaching alphabetics, and then we'll transition to real, meaning what do routines look like in Minnesota ABE? So some of them are what I have talked about or heard about from ABE teachers, or actual routines I've observed. And then Teresa will share her in-classroom experiences. Like I mentioned, I'll want to share that document of resources with you. And then at the end, we'll give you a chance to talk in breakout rooms. So the first half will be focused on beginning alphabetics. We'll take a break. And then the second half will be focused on intermediate and high or advanced alphabetics. This is the first source of research. It's a textbook. It's called Improving Adult Literacy Instruction, Options for Practice and Research. And it's from 2012, which might seem like a while ago, but it was an important book because it was the first to address ESL students, their unique needs, and how we can address them. This is a quote from page 35. And so what it's presenting are those skills that are often challenges for adult readers. And I've underlined all of them. And I want to assure you that we will touch upon each one of them at one point or another during this webinar. In addition to the big version of this resource, they also have booklets, and you can download those for free from the links website. So if you want to have this resource or the booklets, you can download in print for free. I think it's important to include the extensive work done behind the development of the Common Core standards and the college and career readiness standards in terms of the reading foundational skills. So this is more evidence that these are important to teach. So if you haven't met these skills, RF1 is the print concepts. And it's those skills such as knowing that we read in English from top to bottom, left to right, and page to page. It also includes phonological awareness, which is an oral skill, where you're building students' understanding of spoken words, syllables, and sounds. What do you hear in these words, these syllables, or these sounds? And then RF3, the plunge into phonics and word recognition, working with the long and wide continuum of English alphabetics. And I will show you another resource soon that extends RF3 beyond 5th grade. And here it is. This is from my very favorite resource, Unlocking Literacy, Effective Decoding and Spelling Instruction. The author is Marcia K. Henry. And within this book, she shares everything you've ever wanted to know about alphabetics. I found it fascinating. I loved reading it. However, I know that people who would be as interested in me in alphabetics are a small population. But what I think is important to share with you is this continuum that explains how complex our English alphabetic system is. However, it does align with the reading foundational skills. So as I mentioned before, a very early skill is the phonological awareness, and then the understanding of the Roman alphabet, and then the plunge into Anglo-Saxon consonants and vowels, compound syllables, prefixes, and suffixes, the multi-syllable word parts, Latin roots, and Greek forms. So it is very long and wide, and it can take up to 8 years to become proficient because there's a whole lot of parts and pieces to our alphabetics. Teresa is going to explain what works best for teaching phonics And then, like I said earlier, we'll take a step into more real routines.
Right. So as that very first word implies, these are evidence-based or practices that have been heavily researched and found to have the most gains and the most success with learners and moving them forward. So these are our goals. These are our, as Marn says, our ultimate, our targets here. They don't always happen, but this is what we're aiming for. The first part of our presentation, Marn's presentation, will really be focusing on that phonics level, those first three, I would say three sections that she just showed on that Marcia Henry continuum. So these are for our foundational learners, those beginning and early beginning learners. ESL levels 1 through 4 and ABE 1 and 2. So one practice that shows the most gains is having a routine, especially one that's based on a sequence, that's an established sequence. So that's where I always recommend heavily rely on some kind of curriculum that's already been developed and the experts know this consonant first, this one next, and use them. Don't try to recreate the wheel. Somebody else has already done it, and I'm glad for that. So at this stage, this early stage, the very beginning learners are going to be working with letter names, and then next working on that connection between the symbol and the different sounds that they might make, and then moving up to word parts. These lessons are very short. They should be short, but often. So 10, 15, 20 minutes is the goal. And you do them regularly. I like to do them, and this will come out later, I like to do them right before we do some reading so that we're applying right away the skill that we're working on in alphabetics. The next practice that's really important is thinking about learning styles and using all of them. So that V for visual, A, auditory, kinesthetic, and tactile. What are you doing? What kind of techniques are you doing so that you're using each of these modes for learning? Are you giving chances to hear, to manipulate things, to somehow touch and move the body? So that's important. I know I am visual, so I tend to often just use visual things. So I really have to be conscientious about building in the kinesthetic, which seems to be what most of my learners really need. Also, that going from small to big and big to small. So working on segmenting, breaking things, but also putting things together. So you're going to be moving forward and backwards. So it's important to use both of those directions, from big whole things to parts and vice versa. And that will come out in some of the techniques and also the strategies that we show in a little bit. And then finally, evidence-based instruction. Evidence shows that being explicit with our learners is very, very helpful. I know a small percentage of learners, no matter what their age, can learn quite well on their own without explicit, but that's like 20%, I think. So really most learners, all learners will benefit, but I think ours especially, think of our demographics, they need that explicit more than the above average successful literacy students. So explicit means we start with modeling. You, the teacher, shows things first, that's the I. And then the we is the guided practice stage. And that might last quite a while, going back and forth and guiding learners with a skill and gently correcting and guiding them. That might take quite a while, and you might have to come back to it. And then finally, the U is the student applying things on their own successfully and consistently. So that's I just described the scaffolding that happens, moving from you, the teacher, modeling through guided practice that might be various time periods. And then applying those skills in short text, longer text, doing it on their own.
This first routine would be appropriate for pre-literate or non-Roman alphabet letter students. And it focuses on just learning the alphabet, the lowercase and the uppercase letters. So the first step of this routine would be some drill. So either the teacher could write the taught letters for students to name, or she could say the taught letters for students to write. So it could either be an auditory or a visual drill. After reinforcing those taught letters, names, and forms, then it's time to move into another set of letters that are new. And so you would teach them by showing them or writing them left to right, saying their names more than once. At this point, you could also be introducing the sounds, the single consonants or the short vowel sounds for the Roman alphabet letters, if you think your students can handle it. Then you scaffold into practicing those new letter names and maybe sounds, having students write or trace them on alphabet strips or flashcards. And then the application to text would be guiding students in finding taught letters within familiar visual or print text. So you might have them find all the words that begin with B, or all the words that end in D. And so that helps them see that what they're learning at this very basic level will eventually apply to text, because that is the ultimate goal, having readers be able to read text proficiently. This routine would be for the next level students, although still at beginning levels. It specifically is for beginning ESL students and is promoted by Andrea Eckelberger, who worked formerly for Literacy Minnesota and now Robbinsdale. It's a whole part, whole routine where you're alternating between whole and part. So the first step is to select or create a simple whole story or find a picture or photograph of a whole scene. Read the story to students or discuss the picture or photograph. Then from the text or from the words generated in the picture or photo discussion, select parts driven by that context to teach. So you might select certain consonants or vowels, word endings, word families, or key words to teach. Then using that same list of parts, you will practice phonological processing by doing some categorization, identification, blending, segmenting, rhyming, or sorting. Then you will return to the whole with some comprehension activities. Retells, close, rereads, 6W questions, sequencing, what happens next. If you're interested in teaching sequentially, once students are ready for letter sound patterns, this is an incredible phonics sequence from Marcia K. Henry. She calls it a logical sequence, where she presents how to teach the single consonants, the S blends, the endings, the consonant blends, the short vowels and consonant clusters, and those vowel variations from simple to complex, common to less common, to unpredictable or irregular. So this gives you a sample of the first part of the sequence, which is very basic. If you were at the last webinar when we talked about diagnostic reading assessment, this would be aligned with Sylvia Green's level 1 word list. The other part of the sequence gets into the long vowel or the glided vowel patterns, 3-letter sounds, and then the irregulars. And you can see how complex it gets. But if you teach as many of these letter sound patterns as you can, it works 85% of the time. So actually there are more regular patterns than irregular. And the words in parentheses in this chart offer you a word example so that you can tap into your inner knowledge and bring that out in order to teach. But this is something that teachers asked me for many, many years, over many, many years. And so I was delighted to see this just easy to follow sequence from Dr. Henry. If you are able or interested in teaching sequentially, the most common approach is called synthetic, where you are combining parts, single letter sounds, or any of the sound letter patterns into wholes. So using her suggested sequence, you might start at the very beginning with the letters M, L, S, T, A, which are the most predictable. You would say their name and you would say their sound, and students would repeat. And whenever you're teaching sounds, you want to keep it short and clipped. Rather than saying ma, you would try to say m. Rather than saying la, you would try to say l, s, t, and a. It takes some practice, but it's a better way for students to hear the sounds, so they're not hearing an extra vowel attached to the consonant. Your next step would be to do some phonological processing, where you're asking them, what do you hear at the beginning of teacher? A very familiar word in their environment. What do you hear at the beginning of student? And what do you hear at the end? Then you would present words that are made up from the set of letters. And at first, they're not very interesting. They're very, very basic. But as you add more letters, consonants and vowels, you can be much more creative with the phonetic word list. So these are all words that can be blended and segmented. There's no irregularities in them. And by the way, this routine, as most of these routines, are not intended to be accomplished in one session or in one day, but rather over days, weeks, sometimes even months. In order to create context, you will also need to teach some sight words. So you would pick another small set of sight words and introduce them. Talk about whether they follow the rules or not, and make sure that your students are looking at these words as you talk about them. And then you would model and guide oral readings of these short sentences using words that they have been taught. This is probably the most common approach in phonics materials. My experience with Moby Max is that it's a great synthetic approach to use online. Teresa will tell us about analogy phonics, a second approach.
Right. So analogy phonics, I think of it as one type of analytical phonics. So instead of, it's the opposite of synthetic. Instead of putting things together, you're kind of pulling them apart and looking inside of them. So analogy phonics, students will be looking, comparing the rhymes. So they'll look at one rhyme, for example, the AB spelling. It sounds like ab. And then they'll be comparing it to other or similar patterns and making that connection. So they're looking for patterns, analogies. Oops, can you go back? There you go. So they're using a known, a taught pattern to then figure out an unknown, the next one. If you change the onset, the k to the d, then what would it be? Dab. So they're using that comparison. I did get a lot of mileage out of this after teaching synthetics, and I'll get into it later, but I find that this pattern, a little bit larger pattern, really worked with my students who have learning disabilities, because that segmenting and blending really was difficult. We went through all of it, so they did have an initial introduction to all of those that Marn just went over, but it just didn't stick. So I found when I moved to this analogy phonics, the patterns stuck better, and they weren't trying to put things together. The two fellows really were challenged by the synthetic because they often went back to the letter name instead of the sound. So what sound does C make? C. So things like that. This is analogy phonics. It lends itself to different techniques that you can do manipulatives with. So I use the cards. Marn has taken, she has teaching analogy phonics on the Atlas website. So she developed that for us. And so I've used that resource and cut the cards. And so the students can manipulate the onsets and the rhymes. And I recently saw a cute little technique on a live stream. No, it was a YouTube, thank you. So there's two coffee cups and the students can manipulate and just slide it down. So we have the k, ab, and then we slide, well, what would it be if I changed the k to d? So that's kind of a fun manipulative that I saw recently. And then just like Marn described, you want to move from that modeling, that very auditory and visual, we're writing and kinesthetic, and then putting it into some context. So again, thinking of some sight words, which ones are you working on in your classroom? Maybe work on some content, creating sentences together, modeling that, so that they have a context for reading these and encountering them, not as an alphabetics lesson per se. And just like Marn mentioned, this doesn't all happen all at one time. So for example, this set of rhymes, I would probably spend several class times with my two fellows, and we would review these, and then I would introduce a new sound. And then we would review that one. So I had a routine that came around here. So, and then the building up to sentences. This is several class periods, and it everybody's class periods meets differently. These two fellows were just once a week, so it was a much slower process. The next.
Teresa, can I add something
Yes,
about
please do.
analogy phonics?
Yes.
The research behind analogy phonics is that our brains prefer patterns. And so this presents students with chunks that are patterns that can be more easily stored in the brain and retrieved. So rather than the vast number of letter sound patterns, this might be more effective for some students because it assists with the storing and retrieval.
Exactly. Like I mentioned, those patterns are, our brains seek out patterns. And there was a question in the chat. Those two fellows are native born English speakers. English was their only language. But I have used this with English language learners, and likewise, the patterns kind of speed things along quite a bit, because even if there were gaps, you can fill like a vowel gap, because you're going to encounter certain vowel sounds in these rhyme patterns. So I find that it works with English learners quite well, as long as they know most of those letter sound correspondences. This is a quick way to make more sense. Thank you. And another analytical phonics routine, separating wholes into parts. So Marn set this up as kind of a sort that could be cut. You can see here that it starts at the word level rather than the sound level. So the students will be analyzing the parts to decode based on a spelling pattern. Now, something like this, I like to use with my English language learners and native born speakers of English. With my language learners, I like to do this sort as a blind sort first. So I'm modeling, I set up the headings, I show them the headings, the cake, and we talk about that long vowel sound, how the A is saying its English name, A, cake, and compare it to the sound in the middle of the word cat. And we call that a short A sound, ah, ah. And I really model that in the sound difference. And then I set those up as the headings, and then we have an oddball, ones that aren't going to fit under that short A sound or the long A sound. And I'm holding these cards to my chest in the blind sort. And so I pull one out, it might be face. Does that sound more like cake, the middle A sound in cake, or the middle A sound in cat? Face, cat. And then I'll show them. So face sounds more like the A in cake, and I'll put it down. And so we do that first run through, I usually do as a blind sort. So they're tuning their ear in, kind of building some of that phonemic awareness that kids usually get before they ever enter school. So it's kind of a way of building that phonemic awareness that can be missing. So Marn, what would you like to add to analytical phonics routine?
I use this with both of the young readers that I tutor, and I can make my own sort in about 10 to 15 minutes. So Words Their Way is a curriculum you can purchase. There's about 12 books. You buy a master teacher copy, so you can copy for yourself and copy for your students. But a cheaper way to do it is to create a table similar to what is on the screen. put in your headers. I don't do oddballs. I usually make a sort of 3-letter sounds that are similar but different. And then I have a word list, and you just Google EE words, EA words, and many word lists come up. And then I just transfer those words that I think are important for the student to learn into the table, save, print, and cut. So it can be very efficient, and it's really a good way to follow up the synthetic and the analogy instruction.
Good. Keith had a question. So what I mean by blind sort, and that's usually my initial sort, blind means they aren't seeing the words. So I'm holding the cards in my own hand. And so I'm seeing the word face, but they are not seeing it. They're just hearing it and helping me to distinguish that long vowel sound from the short vowel sound using only their ears, not their eyes. They don't get to see the card the first time. But later, then once we have it sorted into those 2 columns, we'll read through each column. And so I'll read cat, mad, hand, page. Oh, what? Something isn't working. Well, look how it looks. So then we're seeing the difference. There's where the analysis part comes in, where they start not just analyzing the sound, they start analyzing the spelling patterns. So it didn't sound the same and it didn't look the same either. So we move it to the other column. And then I do like the oddball, because look at what there in the middle. It's like, it looks like it's wat, but it doesn't have a short A sound. It has one of those other A sounds. So that's why it comes in handy sometimes for the oddball. But definitely, as Marn said, if you want to keep it clean and keep kind of trustworthy rules, you don't have to have the oddball all the time, but you will find that words sometimes just don't fit. Anything else in that chat? I think we got it.
This routine is something I've been using with one of my students. She's in 2nd grade, but reads between kindergarten and 1st grade. She's really struggled with English alphabetics. And I only see her twice a week for an hour. So the time I have with her is very limited. So I decided to blend phonics with fluency. It's not as sequential as I would like, but it's an example of how sometimes you have to move from the ideal to the real in order to make it fit the setting or the situation. So I begin by selecting a read words passage at an appropriate grade level and Lexile level, and I tend to select on the low side of the Lexile level because she really struggles and she gets easily discouraged. Then I do a peruse of that story and find a letter sound pattern that appears in one or more of the words. For example, we recently read a story about a woman who invented an ice cream maker with a bucket and a tin can, ice and rock salt. So the pattern I chose was ice. And then I created a word family list of all the ice words I thought she could handle that did not get too complicated. So you can see the sample list there. Then I modeled the word from the passage, and she actually finds all of the words that are in the passage. And then we practice the word family. I segment, I blend, she segments, she blends. We reread them 4 or 5 times both days, and then I dictate them to her for spelling. And that exchange between reading and spelling is really important at this level, and it really solidifies the letter sound patterns in the brain if you can both blend and segment words. Then we start reading the passage, and for her we have to start with an echo reading, phrase by phrase. I read the phrase, she rereads each phrase. She's not comfortable going beyond this type of echo read for 3 to 4 times. And then we move to sentence by sentence. And then finally, she's built the confidence to read it by paragraphs, with me helping her whenever she needs help. And it's been really rewarding to see her progress with this 5th step. Because when I first started working with her, she was reluctant to read anything on her own. She never got to that 5th step of being confident enough to read most of it accurately at a good rate with appropriate phrasing and even with some expression. So this is an alternative that I have found to be very effective for readers who are anxious to be reading, not just studying words.
I'm coming. Okay, in my one-room schoolhouse setting here in Buffalo, I've got several different situations. So I do have that one foundational reading, I'll call it a group, but it's really just 2 native-born retired fellows who have been working on reading their entire lives. They're at about a 1st grade equivalent with their general reading scores on a CASAS goals test. They used to be on a TABE test, and they hit grade equivalent 2, and then we switched tests and it went back down. So I'm expecting to see their growth very slowly on that general reading test. Anyway, those guys, they had years and years, intermittent years of that very first kind of phonics, you know, 1 letter to 1 sound correspondence, and very little context. So they'd had that drill for years. So I moved them after about a year together of hitting what was left of those individual letters and sounds. We moved to that analogy phonics, and those patterns really helped them excel. And we used the TAP off of the Atlas website. Right now, we are in the very first Mega Words book, which is a series for decoding multisyllable words. The book 1 covers all of the syllable types, and the first 2 are the open syllable and the closed syllable. So we've been working in that book for about a year, and we go really slowly. I go really slowly with that group. So really right now, we're really applying that open syllable and closed syllable. And in their reading, we have some leveled readers that we've really liked from Oxford Press. So I've been working in the level 1, 2, and 3. So as we're reading and they run into a multisyllable word that is unknown to them, then I remind them, well, what do we do? How do we break this multisyllable word? And we've had lots of practice in that, our alphabetics time. So then they'll go to, well, we scan for the vowels, and then we're going to scoop. If there's more than 1 consonant between the vowels, we're going to split in the consonants. that type of thing. So that's where that little group is at. And then I also have an open lab. And right now I have one advanced English language learner. So she is at that level 6, given a CASAS Life and Works test for her general. And you know, she's really reading at like a 6th grade equivalency. So I made some assumptions on that, and I'll speak to that family lit at the same time. I also have 2 advanced English language learners in my family literacy class. And same thing, those two ladies that you see pictured, they have grade equivalent reading scores of 6th grade and 7th grade. So I made some assumptions. Bad thing to do, but I made some assumptions because their vocabulary skills were matching their general reading skills. And so I thought, I don't really need to cover the basic phonics, but I'll get back to them later. So in that family literacy, I also have 2 pre-lit students. So it's, you know, ideally, I'd be moving through those 5 consonant sounds and 1 vowel sound sequentially, and I am, but the sequence is very drawn out because attendance is very slow. So I do that same routine that Marn talked about, the very initial one, but it might be 2 weeks in between. And so I have set up kind of the to-do list printed out like that Dr. Henry's list. And it's like, what have we covered? What are they successful with? And so next time they show up, I can just look at the list and see, well, where are we at, and jump back in. So it ends up being very individualized. So I can work with one group when the other one's working independently. And then it just is very much on the fly, like, where is this student at when they're there? And I can look in their folder and say, okay, we're on this next set of words, letters, I mean. And then when they work individually, I can work with the other groups. So I really need to have 2 phonics groups going at the same time, one at a foundational level and one more advanced. And I think I've mentioned everything I've said in the routines there, that analogy phonics really helped out, and I use mega words as well. Any questions for me? Because I felt like I was talking and thinking of new things as I went there.
Any questions about anything so far?
Okay.
To wrap up the routines, I want to be sure to mention a routine for teaching the sight or instant words. And everything you need to teach these words you can find at www.sightwords.com. It's a very friendly website that gives you the lists. You can download and print flashcards. You can make games. There's online activities that students can work on. It was intended for children, so you'll want to pick carefully. But just like with the phonetic words, you pick a small set of key Dolch or Fry instant words. They're different lists. Fry's word list was built upon the Dolch list, and Dr. Fry's intention was to expand that list. Inform students that these words are used frequently in text and they need to be known well, instantly, automatically. When you're presenting them, talk about them. Do they follow the patterns that we know or not? Most key sight words or instant words begin or end correctly. So there's still the ability to sound out part of the word but knowing them quickly tremendously adds to fluency. If they have a meaning, you can talk about it. Many of them really don't have a meaning, but you can talk about how they're used in sentences. And then use that multisensory method. They see it, they hear it, they read it, they might trace it or spell it. And then if they need more practice, then you can provide in your setting. You can look at those sitewords.com online activities. The chat has been very quiet, so either there aren't questions or we've answered your questions, but I would like to do a quick poll before we take a break that asks, which beginning alphabetics routine that either Teresa or I have presented or one-room schoolhouse situation fits your classroom best? And I added none of the above in case you don't teach the beginning skills. So if you would just answer that question quickly, it would be of great interest to me. I see analogy popping up. More analogy. Okay. Analogy or blended. Glad to see blended might work. Okay, a combination. And a combination is actually best.
I think there's more research on the synthetic, right? And really saying that that's the most helpful, but that's why a mixture of both really with our students.
Yeah. Okay. All right, good. I'm happy to see none of the above. So that means we are providing you with some new practices. Great, thank you. We will take a 5-minute break. And then, like I said earlier, we'll come back and talk about routines for teaching intermediate advanced alphabetics. Welcome back. We are running a little bit behind. I'm hoping we still have time for a breakout, but can't guarantee that, and I hope you're okay with that. These are the features of what works best for intermediate advanced alphabetics instruction, meaning teaching how to decode multisyllable words. The first step is that you select a limited number of parts. You can go one syllable type at a time, but sometimes you can teach 2 prefixes, 2 roots, or 2 suffixes at a time, but no more than 2. So you're focusing on a particular multisyllable pattern. As we've mentioned before, you start with modeling. So you model the new word part pronunciations, their spellings, their meanings, and any changes that they might make in a root or base word. Then you begin with modeling the reading of familiar words, words they know in their spoken language. So you take the word and you present it in chunks. So it's that segmenting and blending again. And then you guide students' rereadings of the words and meaning making. So at intermediate advanced, you have to bring in more discussion of meaning, but you still want to keep it in alphabetics rather than a vocabulary lesson. If students are ready, and again, this is over multiple days, maybe even several weeks, Then you scaffold to less familiar words, which gives them better application of the taught skill. And you work through it the same with rereadings and meaning making. And then you transition into sentence composition. You can do it orally, and then they can be assigned to write their own sentences, or oral readings of paragraphs and passages. You do not have to search for passages that contain the taught patterns or words. It can be a text with any multisyllable words that will still give them practice in applying the word skills. The most common routine for teaching multisyllable words is called disassembly, where you are literally disassembling or unbuilding whole words into parts. And you do this by teaching the syllable types and the syllabication rules. The most common syllable type is the closed syllable. So you would talk about what a closed syllable is. It has only one vowel. It always ends and often begins with a consonant. The vowel most of the time has a short sound. Well, actually, always it has a short sound, but sometimes that short sound is schwa, and it's spelled with different vowels. If you're looking at a multisyllable word and you see double consonants in the middle, that's a cue to divide the word between those consonants and sound out the closed syllable. After you've explained the pattern, then you would apply it to words, again, from familiar to less familiar. So the three that I chose to start with are Batman, instep, and upset, which are actually compound words. And compound words are the best place to start because they are two whole words. They aren't always closed syllables, but they're two whole words that generally students would be familiar with once they know to chunk them. Then you would progress into words that aren't necessarily words, like absent. Ab is not a word on its own, but sent is. Con is not a word. Well, sometimes it's a word. Test is a word. Den is a word. Tist is not. So the focus is on teaching them to look for the double consonant and break the word into that decodable part. The words at the bottom demonstrate the schwa. So gal-un has that schwa sound rather than gal-lan. Problem has that schwa sound rather than prob-lem. And lesson has the schwa sound rather than lesson. That sounded very similar. It's always a progression so that as you're building these skills, they're better able to apply them to more and more words. You don't have to create any curriculum for teaching in this approach. I created an alphabetics curriculum, and it includes compound words and all the common prefixes and suffixes. So it begins with a cover slide that identifies the pattern. In this case, it's able and ibble. Each lesson set explains what syllables are. If you're starting with that set, you can go in any order you want. So this is always part of that set. Then it goes into specifically the syllable or the pattern, the prefix or suffix pattern. So this tells you that able and able are vowel suffixes. They mean can or able to. I learned this, I didn't know this. Able forms more familiar words, whereas able forms more academic words. And then it also includes any spelling changes that occur. Often one is dropping the silent E. The modeling and guided practice are presented in a table format where I have broken the word, I have disassembled the word, so that you can practice that segmenting and blending with students. And then I also give the meaning and some examples. So two things that are breakable are glass and ice. And there's multiple slides of these charts, so you can pick and choose how many you want to present. And each set ends with a matching activity or a sentence completion activity or a sentence combining activity, where I was able to write a paragraph with 8 to 10 of the top words. And some of the sentences can be combined into a more higher level paragraph. Teresa will talk through the assembly method, which is less frequent, but as effective.
Right, and I hate to put you on the spot, but can you think that there was some research in that research review a couple of years ago that said understanding these meaning parts, the morphemes, really gave a lot of mileage, like it was the most important part to help comprehension. And so I was trying to remember that research, Marn. If you think of it, maybe you can chat.
Yeah, I don't remember the title, but I remember what they did and how they came to that conclusion. So they looked at 10 reading component skills, and they looked at other research. So it was a meta-analysis, and they focused on the correlation between teaching that skill and comprehension progress. And much to my surprise and their surprise, knowing more themes had the greatest correlation with an increase in comprehension.
Yeah, that was just...
It was most significant.
It really made this an attractive kind of routine here that the students were going to get a lot out of it. So we start by looking at these parts. The part in the middle is the root or the base. Here they're calling it bound or free. So that just means, can that root stand alone or not? So it's really a root that's bound if it needs to be glued to something else to make sense. A base or a free, as another word for that, is that middle that can stand all of it on its own and have meaning. So we've got rupt, that's bound. It cannot stand on itself. I can't put rupt in a sentence. It needs to be glued to something else. But words like port or tract, those bases get built on, but they could stand on their own as well. So then we start assembling, start building on to our root. So this root means to break or to burst. And then we can start adjusting its meaning if we add derivational prefixes and suffixes. So we derive a different meaning when we glue those parts on. So the prefixes that you are going to glue on in a moment, dis mean apart, inter, between, e, out. So that can change. Disrupt can mean to break apart. Maybe you're talking to someone and I disrupt you. I'm breaking apart your conversation. So, or I could erupt. Something is breaking out. The volcano erupted. It broke out of the ground. And then the derivational endings over on the right side are the suffixes that we glue onto the end that can change the meaning, derive a different meaning. So maybe we have disruption. Shun means active, so that's the act of breaking apart. And then ibble and iv. And then the inflectional, those are going to change when and where. You know, most often it's going to be like a verb that's changing its tense, or a noun that's changing number, or to a gerund. So those inflectional endings. So I'm going to give you, I think, about a minute and a half. That sound about right? See how many of these, how many words you can assemble using that root of rupt. Get your papers out. We have, the next slide has the some answers, but I'll give you some quiet for at least a minute. About 15 more seconds. And then chat out how many you found. Can you count them up? Stop. Anybody willing to chat how many you found? Made 14 from Laura. Anybody beat that? 16, 15? Good. 15, Carrie, good job. It's fun. Good job too. Good to see you. Or at least know you're there. Thank you. So 16, oh, awesome, Joanne. Good, so with these, with these morphemes, the words we build, so then it's like, where do we go from here? So a couple of ideas. I do like to write a few close sentences, kind of start putting it in a context for, there you go. So I'll talk as you're comparing your list to our key here. Disrupt, interrupt, erupt. So we got just adding the prefixes. And then the next row is having the prefix dis, but then changing the inflectional endings. And then adding some derivational endings. And then starting with the next prefix. Good. So as I was saying, you could, after you've assembled these words, then what? It's not like you are reading an article with all of these words in it. They're just not going to show up. So you can create some sentences to read. I would say I would create probably 3 to 5 sentences that I'm targeting a different form of each word and make it a closed sentence. So then they have to choose the correct form of the word to fill into that closed sentence. In the past, I'm like, let's write sentences right away. And it was just too much too soon. So build up the familiarity and do some scaffolding until you're writing sentences on your own. And then they can use the sentences that you've modeled to create their own and use those sentences as models. I would love some ideas where to go next, because I love working with morpheme matrices, but then it's like, what's the next step? What can I do with them when there's not a ready-made context for them? Anybody work with these? You can give me ideas. What do you think about it?
Ready to move on?
Yes, yes.
This is another blended routine that I use with my 5th grade student who has a solid foundation of phonics. There's a few gaps, and so I use sorts, and we play with those to reinforce those gaps. So my blended alphabetics and vocabulary routine is similar but different to the alphabetics and fluency routine. Because he's in 5th grade, I can go beyond ReadWorks and choose from News ELA or Common Lit, again at an appropriate grade level and Lexile level. I choose 6 to 8, always multisyllable vocabulary words, some suggested by the publisher and some not, because I'm looking for particular patterns, but yet they are key to understanding the content. And so we use disassembly because we have the words. And so we chunk them, we pronounce them, we talk about the meaning. I give a sentence example, and then he gives a sentence example on the first day. And then on the second day, he actually writes some sentences for the vocabulary words. He also finds the words in the passage. So I will say, in this paragraph, you need to look for competition. In this paragraph, you need to look for tragic. And he really enjoys finding those words in the text. And that's before we read it. And then, like with the other student, we read the passages more than once. We do an echo first, which is not his preference, but I pick the first read and he picks the second read, which is always a collaborative. And by the time we're doing the collaborative, he really has learned more words in order to read accurately at an efficient rate with phrasing and some expression. So it works well over our 2-day session. Sometimes we have to carry it over into 3, but it's an effective routine for 2 days of 1 hour each.
I have a couple of situations out in Buffalo. So one is a structured class, a STAR reading class. So they're at the intermediate reading level and dipping a little lower. So I have one native-born student who's been a reading student for decades. And then within the same class, I have 4 language learners from around the world. And they're at about the same reading level, reading range, I should say. So we've got about 4th grade reading range to about 7th grade reading level in the same class. Some of those students, 3 of them, haven't been with me for more than a year. So they missed when we built up and learned all the syllabication rules. So that's really, they don't have that strategy down solid. So really in class right now, we're meeting online virtually, and I scan pages of mega words. We're in book number 4, so we're really focusing on suffixes. and word parts. But the gap of knowing, having a strategy to break multi-syllable words is something I need to like pause what we're doing and review. So I do that pretty regularly. And I have a bookmark that they have at home, and it has all with them at home, and it has the different syllabication rules. So I have them pull that out periodically and review open and closed syllables especially. So our routine is vocabulary, and then we do alphabetics with the mega words. And mega words I like because it builds in for me. I don't have to think about the forward and the backwards, large to small. It has activities going both directions, from large to small, from small to large, back and forth. So that helps me. And if we're starting to get it, we don't have to do all of the pages. So if there's a complex or a new issue, we might do all of the pages on a specific skill or focus. Like right now we're on the TION endings. So I model, I do when we're doing an activity. I always start out by modeling, and then I guide them. They start taking turns, but I'm there to jump in and ask them questions and prompts about, well, why did you do that? Or how could you do that differently? And then we do our reading, and quite often I've been using the News for You right now. I do have some books on order that we'll have in our hands soon, but we use the News for You. And I start by reading having it read the whole story to them so they can hear it once. And then our routine is for them to take that over the weekend. So we listen to the new one on Wednesday, we choose one. And then their homework is to echo read. So we've practiced that routine in class. So they, over the weekend, they do a sentence by sentence echo read of the News for You article. And then when we come back on Monday, I pull that same article up and they take turns reading. And that's where I can guide their application of whatever the skill is, the TION, and the syllabication. I want to build up to the choice between using different strategies. Are we going to attack this multi-syllable word using a sound technique like syllabication, or can we see meaning parts that we know and use those morphemes, have a couple of different strategies, and knowing that you don't have to rely on just one. What can we do when we run into a word that is unfamiliar to us? And I think I started telling the story earlier and realized, okay, my story had more to do with these more advanced learners. I have 2 language learners in that English, in that family learning class. And like I said, their vocabulary and their reading levels are like grade 6 and grade 7. So I know their vocabulary. As they learn more vocabulary, their comprehension skills go up at this kind of the same rate. So I was believing that I would hold them back if I went all the way back to phonics because they were reading at a pretty advanced level. So I made the assumption that they didn't need those lower level phonics, that I'd be holding them back by going back that far. They didn't need it. They were reading and comprehending. But what I was finding is that when they ran into multisyllable words, they didn't have the same language that I did. I couldn't say, well, if you break after the consonant, the vowel is going to be short in that syllable. I couldn't use that language because they weren't distinguishing long from short. They just knew it. So I needed to go back And I did a spelling test with them to see which vowel sounds were gaps, or maybe some leftovers from their first language that were confusing. And so now I'm kind of systematically going back to the beginning of the long vowels that they missed and start with those, so I can use that language. And I'm thinking, Christine and I were talking a lot about writing in the last couple of weeks, that not having some of that phonics instruction, the short vowel, long vowel, the syllables, it's hindering their ability to write. So I'm changing my strategy there, and I am going to go back and kind of go through some of those long vowel patterns and start there. Any questions? Yay, Christine, yes. There's other reasons to do the phonics at these higher levels.
I apologize, we won't have time for a breakout. I see 2:30, but I want to show you this chart that was created last year. And if you have additions that you want me to add, you can send them to me and I would be happy to do that. So across the top, you'll see all 4 reading components. So this chart is useful for webinars 3 through 6. Looking down alphabetics, you'll see that they have been categorized as free from Atlas or links, meaning some of them you can access from Atlas and also from links. Free websites that are popular amongst our EBRI teachers, subscription websites, and then print for purchase. Teresa mentioned MegaWords multiple times. That's an 8-book series for teaching everything about alphabetics you and your students ever wanted to know. Words Their Way is that analytic series of books. Some are targeted for ESL students and the others for beginning and advanced readers. They are linked, so if you're interested in looking at them right away, then you're able to link them from this document. So I hope that you gained either more interest or more confidence in teaching alphabetics, along with some either evidence-based or proven routines. And now you have access to lots of materials. So it's up to you to get started with the wonderful world of teaching alphabetics. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me and I would be happy to talk further about alphabetics.